Hello, everyone. This is my second to the last lecture, and it will blend basically right into my last lecture. This is photojournalism and documentary photography. I'm going to go directly to playing this, if I can. I'm going to view. Well, let's go to here. I'm going to view this, enter full screen, and that was a mistake. Excuse. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to hit this boy. I'm going to share. And we are sharing the screen. We're going to go to view this as full screen. And I want to talk first about Eugene Atget. He was a French street photographer. And his plan was to photograph the buildings and streets of Paris before modernization. He was inspired by the Surrealists. He also recorded the prostitutes who lived on the streets. He photographed windows and the content of window shopping all over Paris. And destruction was at hand, modernization was at hand. So he recorded, the life of the streets of Paris. Here's another window scene, and that's him. I want to take a shot in the dark. This is one of his prostitutes. That's Eugene Atget again. Henri Cartier-Bresson was another street photographer, noted for, these are prostitutes in Mexico City. And this is one side of the Berlin Wall, which, by the way, having been there, you don't want to climb it or even pretend like you're climbing it. Timing was everything to him. He also recorded French life. Notice the biscuits on the table look like they're Picasso's hands. And he did a series of people and their cats. This is Dali, and this is a poet. This is Georgia O'Keeffe and her cat. And he did some fashion photography as well. Diane Arbus was a street photographer in New York City. She grew up in relative wealth. Her family owned a department store that she worked at. And at one point she wanted to travel to Europe with her father to go shopping. No, to help him do his purchasing overseas, frankly. And when she came back, she realized she didn't understand life and she wanted to go on the street and be a photographer. This is considered one of her more disturbing photographs of a little boy acting up holding a little plastic toy hand grenade. This is one of her very famous photographs of twins. These are not the same twins. But she photographed basic life. And she also photographed people who were on beyond the edges of society. Married couple. And he is known as the Jewish giant, who's like 9 feet tall. And those are his parents. And this is a transvestite. She also photographed people who we would have called then circus freaks. At her parents' home, at her parents' business, she met Alan Arbus, whom she married. And at one point in the early 70s, she committed suicide. She took her life after their divorce. And it took 2 days for them to find her in her apartment. Alan Arbus went on to have an acting career. He played Dr. Freeman on the television show MASH. David Hume Kennerly was a photojournalist, and most of his work was photographing the inside life of the presidents. Here he is with Kennedy, photographing Kennedy and Carolyn Kennedy, and apparently a pony. Here he is on the far right, photographing Richard Nixon. and Robert Kennedy. This is Betty Ford, First Lady Betty Ford, married to Jerry Ford. And Bill Clinton and Hillary. Betty Ford again. He was also on the set for the last taping of Seinfeld. And this is a gathering of then all of the living presidents, which he took this rather notable photograph. Jimmy Carter on the far right, Clinton, George W. Obama, and George H.W. from right to left. Here he is photographing Jerry Ford, or with Jerry Ford. He was also did some time photographing in Vietnam. And these are Korean female soldiers marching with their guns. And I don't think that's Kennerly himself. That's someone else took, but he took that picture, and it was during an anti-war demonstration. And this is the Muhammad Ali fight, 1963. I believe it's 63. And that's Kennerly himself. Margaret Burke White. Margaret Burke White went to she studied photography in New York City. And she decided at 23 that she wants to be rich and she wants to be famous. She was an incredibly bold photographer. She photographed steel mills in Ohio and went really where the liquid molten steel is being poured and photographed in the blazing heat of a steel mill. Here she is on one of the gargoyles, if you will, on one of the Chrysler building in New York City without any harness or anything, photographing the skyline of New York City. And during the poverty of the 1930s, here's a lot of Black people in the food line. Behind them is a poster that says, "There's no way like the American way." She did the first cover photo of Life magazine in 1936, which she co-owned. And she was at Buchenwald during the liberation of the Jews. She marched with the army towards the liberation of the Jews. So she was in their concentration camp as, they're being saved. That's a rough time. And here they are absolutely cheering that their misery, their nightmare is over. She photographed children in the South. And this is from South Africa, where all these people were working in the diamond mines. And these are two guys working in the blazing heat of the diamond mines, incredibly hot down there. And the impoverished of the South, a home in the South. Notice how much it leans. Poverty in the South. In World War II, she also photographed, she traveled with Black troops and special divisions of Black-only troops, and committed her thinking towards their representation photographically during the war. And this is a guy basically using the gravity of his weight to tighten a bolt on a significant slope. That's a picture of Margaret Burke White, and that is one cool camera, I gotta tell you. Here she is. She had, during World War II, wanted to fly with a bombing mission. And they said, "Oh, no, a nice little girl like you can't be up where it's dangerous like that." And ultimately they let her go. And they told her these planes are not heated. It's going to be 40 degrees below zero. You'll need a flight suit. And whatever you touch, be careful, because your hands will stick to it. It was so cold up there. She had to wear a flight suit to go on this bombing mission. And this is her favorite photograph of herself. And these are pilots on bombing missions. And that's one of the photographs she took as they approached Germany on a bombing mission. She photographed Gandhi, and she was told that this is his day of silence. You can't talk to him. I presume this is an Inuit child. She also photographed one of the Douglas airplanes flying over New York City. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this is a bridge that was bombed in World War II and collapsed into the river, which makes the bridge useless. And here she is. Here is one of her photographs from World War II as Americans were lobbing explosives into German positions on a distant hillside. She photographed Stalin. She had extraordinary access to the Soviet Union. She photographed workers in the fields in the Soviet Union. She photographed the bombing of Moscow by the Nazis. And this is part of a mill. Now, this goes back to the very first photograph, one of the earliest photographs I showed you of the food line with everyone's being black, and above it says, world's highest standard of living. And these are Arabian troops lining up to work with the British in World War II by camel. They're going to fight the Germans by camel. We're back in Russia now, and these are women working on the food line. Welders, women welders. And this is again Gandhi on his day of silence. She's not allowed to speak to him. Children, black children in school. Elizabeth Lee Miller, and I've mentioned her before to you, was a very noteworthy model. Her career was ruined by being in a Kotex ad in 1928. So photographs by Edward Steichen, he gave her some money to go to Europe, and a letter of introduction to Man Ray. She went to Europe, and there she met Man Ray and ultimately became a war photographer. This is one of her photographs of a child during the end of segregation of schools. And that's Lee Miller with a special helmet that she wore so that she could prop up the visor for her camera. And these are refugees in front of a pile of bones. And this is a collaborator being exposed at the end of the war, collaborated with the Nazis. And these are British women nurses. And this is after the London Blitz, when the Nazis pounded London and basically reduced it to rubble. So they basically built a little stove out of a pile of bricks and they're cooking. And a woman soldier. And this is, again, she was also at the liberation of Buchenwald as well as Dachau. What a desperate scene. So again, this is a view of her with a helmet, and that's her helmet propped up. I should have doubled up on that other picture. Henri Hewitt was a French war photographer in Vietnam. Vietnam, before America's entry, had been a French colony, and the French were chased out, and so America picked up where they left off. And so he photographed the Vietnam War. And this is a fallen soldier they're trying to resuscitate. Hewitt when an explosion went off near him and threw him into a ditch. He's in shock right here, but he recovered. In the burial of American soldiers. Children in Vietnam. What a compelling shot. Wow. Children in a bomb shelter in Vietnam. American soldiers. Americans tending to the injury of a North Vietnamese soldier. These pictures really speak for themselves. Nick Ut. Nick Ut was a Vietnamese war photographer during the Vietnam War, and he took some of the most famous pictures you will ever see. This is an incredibly famous photograph from the Vietnam War. The naked girl, her clothes were burning and they were ripped off of her by her brother, and she had to run for her life. So they're evacuating their little hamlet where they lived. And this is a destroyed church and a guy praying in a destroyed church. That's Nick Ut. It's a very current photograph of him. He wasn't great during the war. Harry Benson, photojournalist. Harry Benson photographed celebrities. And that's Andy Warhol. That's Harry Benson. He photographed the Beatles extensively. This is a shot called Pillow Fight of the Beatles. The Beatles performing and practicing, rehearsing. Clinton and Hillary. Martin Luther King. The Nixon resignation. Muhammad Ali. Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles. Now, I have to tell you a fast story. When I was in school, one of my instructors was Scott Enyart. And at the time of the Kennedy assassination, he had, as a kid, 15-year-old, with his camera, snuck into the Los Angeles hotel and was standing next to Harry Benson when the shots were fired and Kennedy was shot. And he said that Benson elbowed him and shoved him out of the way so Benson could just jump in and grab photographs. This is Bobby Kennedy's wife trying to stop the camera. And that's Bobby Kennedy down being consoled by an illegal alien, apparently, they said. This is President Eisenhower, President Johnson, Kennedy. So he photographed a lot of these celebs. This is Ronald Reagan, Nancy and Ronald Reagan. And this is Harry Benson photographing Ronald Reagan in a hotel in Los Angeles. Lee Friedlander was a street photographer. And he made strong use of strong lines and reflections. Notice the difference in attire and the bold line that separates the two characters in this film. He'd photograph on the streets events that defined American culture. That's a charming shot. Notice they're holding up Instamatics. So we're talking the mid-late 60s here. And some people have cell phones here. Wow. That I believe to be his wife. But these are just scenes on the street. And out of his car windows he's driving. That's also his wife. He did a lot of photographs of his wife. She's beautiful. That is Lee Friedlander. William Eggleston was pretty well off, and he pursued color. His whole thing was not black and white photography, but color photography. So he made strong use of color imagery, colors in his photographs. Look at all the yellow, look at all the red here. Also a street photographer, but his photographs were driven by, his photography was all color. Average people doing average things. And these are not staged. He just found them and photographed them. I think this is staged, but I don't know what's going on here. I guess that was sure right onto the table. We're talking into the early 70s here. I'm guessing that from his hair. A monumental tricycle. I believe Randy's Donuts is in Los Angeles. That's William Eggleston again. Gary Winogrand, another street photographer. Gary Winogrand had 3 Guggenheims as a street photographer and is considered the central photographer of his generation. That's Gary Winogrand. So he's capturing, you know, the freewheeling California life. Probably a street in Los Angeles. When Winogrand died, they found basically 3,800 rolls of film that he still needed to develop. His multiple wives said he was constantly photographing, always had a camera in his hand, never stopped taking pictures. And this is a photograph of his. I think it's contesting the question of interracial marriage, arguing that there's nothing wrong with interracial marriage. That's Winogrand. Sebastião Salgado is a Brazilian photographer, and his work revolves around the destruction of the rainforest. And that's Salgado. And these are people who have to work basically like dogs in the rainforest. You're going to find in South America a variety of environments. This to be Africa. But in terms of looking for oil, it is these people slave away and are just, covered in oil, trying to run these oil rigs. Here's a confrontation as people are working between one of the employees and one of the supervisors. I don't know if that went well. These people are carrying on their backs sand or something straight up a hill. I mean, look at what they have to climb. This is their work. This is their labor. And this was taken in the Arctic. What beautiful eyes. Look at that. But he works heavily in the rainforests of Brazil and in the Amazonian parts of Brazil. This is a heartbreak, the way these people have to work. And this is the destruction of the rainforest. Helen Levitt, a street photographer in New York City. Helen Levitt discovered one day that Henri Cartier-Bresson was going to be in New York City, and she found out what hotel he was going to be, and she kind of ambushed him when he came out and said, "Can I walk with you?" And for a day, she walked around with him. And after one day, she decided she understands how he does it. And so she became a street photographer in her own right. That's Helen Levitt. And then later in life, she decided that towards the end of her career, she understood. Whoa, dude, I don't know what that was. She decided that she understood chance and opportunity, and she gave it all up to be a professional gambler. This is all just on the street. None of this is staged. Vivian Mayer. Vivian Mayer was born in like 1928. She was an au pair. She worked in people's homes taking care of their children. She died in like 2009 or something. And she put all her belongings in a storage locker, and she was in a convalescent home where she passed away. And her storage locker in Chicago, ultimately, since the bill wasn't being paid, they took a bolt cutter and cut the padlock off and just put it up for auction. Somebody bought her boxes, opened them up, and found thousands of negatives, and like 150,000 negatives and rolls of unprocessed film. And he contacted all sorts of museums saying, "Can you want to work with me on this?" And they all said, "Nah, no thanks." Today, she's recognized as one of the greatest street photographers of the 20th century. She lived and died in anonymity. She never married. She had basically, as far as we know, no friends. That's a self-portrait of her in a mirror, in a window. And she'd photograph on the streets of Chicago, the streets of New York. And she would take children with her, the children that were her charge, she'd take them with her and walk. She'd wear, let's look at her again. She'd wear a big funny hat and to have two small children with her and walk into neighborhoods where she probably shouldn't be. One more thing, let's look at her camera yet one more time. Notice that her camera has two lenses. She looks down through it and can pre-focus and pre-adjust, pre-calculate what her picture's going to be, and then look up and make eye contact. And people look in her eyes and don't realize that she's photographing them from that camera, which is a waist level camera. What a beauty, look at that. And this is one of the children she was in charge of. And the parents of the children had no clue that she was taking their children. As long as the kids came home safe and fed, they were clueless. That's a great documentary for you all to watch. It's Looking for Vivian Maier, or Finding Vivian Maier. Here's two kids apparently in the state of conspiracy. Mary, that should be Mary, my typo, Ellen Mark. Mary Ellen Mark was a street photographer and a documentary photographer of people who were away from the mainstream of society. Here she is in a psychiatric ward. Basically people who were in poverty. A funeral. Living from the car. I don't know his story at all. Apparently a wedding day, I would think. That's Mary Ellen Mark. She passed away in 1999. Yeah, again, I think we're in a psychiatric ward here. And this is a kid on the street smoking a cigarette and holding her stuffed animal. That's Mary Ellen Mark again. So that marks the end of, I'm going to stop screen share. That marks the end of photojournalists. And okay, I'm going to go directly to my last lecture, which is Photo After 1950. I'm going to hit screen share. And I'm going to hit this. I am sharing screen, I hope. So this next and last lecture has no notes with it, but I would like to suggest to you, you may see a name or someone's working here that you'd like to write about. Your last paper is to write about a photographer. So this may be a great way of finding interesting photographers you were not aware of any other way except for this class. Arnulf Runier was an Australian painter in abstract and surrealism. So he would draw right on top of his paintings, on top of his photographs with paint. Christian Boltanski was an installation and conceptual artist photographer. Conceptual meaning ideas and what do you think? I mean, look at this, little pieces of parts of people's faces. George and Gilbert. Okay, Gilbert Proush and George Proush and Gilbert Passmore, performance art and photo installations in color based on the life on the East End of London. They used a lot of color. They would make montage images. William Wegman, you're going to know this stuff. You know him already. William Wegman likes to photograph his dogs. One of his dogs was Man Ray, and the other dog was Fay Ray. Man Ray is a photographer that we've already talked about. Fay Ray was the actress in the original King Kong. And he would dress his dogs up in the incredibly deadpan looks and made him very successful. He photographed them in 20 by 24 Polaroid, which is huge and expensive. By the way, you almost have to be a good photographer for Polaroid to loan you one of their 20 by 24 Polaroids. You do have to be. They won't even let you near it. Bernhard and Hilda Becher photographed the architecture of Germany, their German architectural structures in grids on cloudy days to eliminate shadows, 35 millimeter. They keep the images objective to record industrialization. And it would lay out these pictures in a grid pattern. The hard industrialization of post-war Germany. Robert Cumming. Robert Cumming was a conceptual photographer that layered things within things. So here's a loaf, a piece of bread, which was, I don't know, permitted to grow in, a water was permitted to grow around it. He's a conceptual photographer, so he's developing ideas of how you see things within things. Bart Parker. Was a Texas photographer. And he would do montage photography, little sets like this. Paul Berger was at the University of Washington. He founded the University of Washington Photo Department and used images from black and white, from blackboards, especially mathematical blackboards. Richard Prince, it's all cowboy stuff. And there was some concern that he had lifted some of his pictures from, well, let's just call it for what it is, Marlboro cigarette ads, and had appropriated the work of others. At one point, he disowned all his work and said, no, 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 no. It's not me, it's not my stuff anymore. Michael Mandel was a conceptual photographer of found objects and street photo of public art, of colored tiles into music. He photographed lots of street cars driving by, and clearly he was not well received doing that. When you stand on the street corners and as cars went by, people photographed people right in their cars. Larry Sultan worked with Mandel on a book called Evidence. Larry Sultan ultimately photographed Paris Hilton in his own parents' bedroom. Barbara Kruger teaches at UCLA, and she would take phrases and put them right on top of photographs. I shop, therefore I am. Just be yourself, 100% natural. Ruin yourself before they do. I think that's Marilyn Monroe. Girls must be pretty. Your body is a battleground. If you don't control your mind, someone else will. Hitler. Victor Bergen was a conceptual artist and employed words in his imagery called, well, here's a good example. Here's words in his imagery. You don't know what it says, but if I zoom in on it, it says, move the camera up and down to agree. Judith Golden, one of America's most powerful voices of the commentary of contemporary issues. She got her MFA from Chicago. She taught at UCLA, and her MFA was from UC Davis. So she's been a major voice. That's a beautiful picture. Cindy Sherman, a legend in her own time. Cindy Sherman, if you were to ask her, she wouldn't say she's a photographer, she would say she's an artist, and she pretty much is. All her pictures are a self-portrait. She's in every one of her pictures. And she started off doing something she called untitled film stills. She got a MacArthur Fellowship, and they look like she took the selfie to a new level. And her film stills look like they'd been taken right out of a movie. Most of her black and whites were shot before she moved to California. And it invites the question of, do we imitate art, or does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? When I was 19, I was in a huge car accident and blood was everywhere and I got a gazillion stitches. And afterwards, all I could say was, man, it was just like being in a movie. You know, the car rolled and all of this. And that goes back, that's the central question of Cindy Sherman's work. Does life imitate art, or does art imitate life? So she moved to California, and apparently she was afraid to go outside because it was just too weird for her. So she dropped a projection screen in her apartment and would project, you know, city scenes, and she would stand in front of and photograph herself in her apartment, in her living room. This is another one of her films. It looks like something out of Hitchcock. Eileen Cowan. Eileen Cowan apparently teaches now at Cal State Fullerton. Very conceptual work. It is driven by questions of family. She has an identical twin sister, and very often she will photograph herself with her sister. You don't know which is which. That's, I guess, her husband. And it talks about infidelity in life. This is the challenge. Look at this picture right now. Look at the challenge of the child, of the mother who has to go off to work, being consoled by an alternate identity of her mother. And in the background, you see a double exposure. Now the mother's holding the child. So it looks at it looks heavily at family relationships. Bummer. Who is this? This is Laurie Simmons. Yeah, this is Laurie Simmons. There's a reverse of order here. Laurie Simmons does still lives, and she bought these life-size sex dolls from Japan, and she organizes them in her photographs, but she also builds little still lives and look at questions of sexual conflict, woman's role in the home. Carl, I don't know how to say his name, Chiarenza. He is a studio-based photographer. He uses aluminum and foil and torn paper to create unrecognizable worlds. It's actually just torn paper or reflections of aluminum foil. James Casimir. James Casimir builds little architectural structures and puts them on what appears to be silver mylar. And the central theme of his work turns on global warming when our homes are being flooded, when how things are going south in society. It looks like an ice cave. And another building flooding. Sandy Scotland is a surrealist. She builds these sets. She takes months to build one of her photographs and uses live people in them. So this is this turns up in photo books all the time, one of her photographs. She likes to use incredibly bright colors that are color contrast to each other, so they seem even brighter. And she'll take months to build these and then photograph them. These don't just happen in a weekend. Olivia Parker is a still life photographer, which is based on the science of natural light and found objects. She tends to use natural light and very flat light to photograph her stuff. Incredibly highly regarded. In this, she's been able to capture emotion into the bowl. I think this one's called Evidence. Joel Peter Witkin is an interesting challenge to talk about. Joel Peter Wickens is some of the most offensive photography you will ever see. I only have 4 of his pieces because I didn't want to drag you through all of it. Joel Peter Wiccan says that as a child, he was coming out of his house with his parents, with his mother to go to church, and they heard a horrific car crash. And he walked out and saw a smashed car, and then suddenly something rolled right up to his feet, and it was the head of a girl who was decapitated in the accident. And he reached down to touch the head, but in a second, an adult grabbed and pulled him away very quickly. His photographs deal with death and corpses, transgender, with dwarfism. Let's look at the stuff. He also accesses dead bodies, which he uses in his photographs sometimes. Unclaimed. Apparently, I was at Photo Independent a number of years ago, and I talked to his assistant. I said, because it's a fact that he accesses dead bodies and cuts them up and puts them into still lifes. And I said to his assistant, how does he get bodies? She goes, it's easier than you think. There are so many places where there are unclaimed bodies that are there for a long time, and ultimately they just want to, get rid of them. But he does a lot of his work in Mexico because of regulations about the artistry involving human bodies. And I saw one where he took a man's head, opened up, made a vase out of it. Dwarfism and transgenderism. This is the work of Joel Peter Wiccan. Patrick Nagatani. Let's look at his stuff. His stuff is, now it looks like an archaeological find out there in the desert north of Yermo, California. I've been to those satellite dishes and photographed them. They're huge. But a lot of his photography is based on his on the Japanese internment camps. He was born in 1945, so he doesn't actually remember the internment camps, but I'm sure he heard all about them from his parents. Jeff Wall is a Canadian photographer, and his work is conceptualism. He deals in large images in Cibachrome of urban decay, most postmodern industrialization, and futurist backdrops. These are incredibly complex sets he builds. And Cibachrome is a incredibly beautiful positive image printing system, goes positive to positive. It's what you would go directly from a slide to a print with. Cibachrome is discontinued, to my knowledge, because it was so poisonous. But it is a great color system, color print, a gorgeous, exquisite color print. But he builds these complex sets. Hollis Frampton is an American avant-garde filmmaker, photographer, writer, and a pioneer of digital art. He's now deceased. Barbara Caston is a still life photographer, and she builds. She is a Chicago photographer, straddles printmaking, sculpture, and textiles. She was inspired by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and the Bauhaus. We discussed them already. At the end of Surrealism, we came to Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So she builds these, and the Bauhaus was an incredibly advanced design group in Germany. Hitler basically chased them out. So they set up camp in Chicago, and they continue. This is actually just planes of glass. David Hockney was the leader of the 1960s pop art movement, and one of his paintings sold for $90 million, a record at the time. He did a series that I saw him speak once, where he was photographing people with a whole bunch of shots, and they didn't have to sit still. It was a way of recording movement. It's almost cubist in your ability to see more than one side of things. And that's his self-portrait, which he did at the same time. But he doesn't ask his models to even attempt to sit still. You know, as part of the action is to get movement. So we're seeing two sides of this woman's face. Holly Roberts paints directly onto her photos, and was a bit of a, she studied printmaking, became curator of prints at the Tamarind Institute. Her influences are in New Mexico and the Native Americans, but she would paint right on top of her photographs. Mike and Doug Starr are identical twins, and they were a very big deal in the 1980s. Their photography could sell for as much as $160,000 a print. And a lot of their photography was based on the fact that they're twins. You know, they would break up their prints. That's both of them in a collage. I don't know which is which. And two horses, so they're horses running as twins. Again, this is Mike and Doug Starr. This is their self-portrait. I don't know which is which. Adam Fuss. Adam Fuss is Australian. His father died when he was quite young. And so he was in private school. He was kind of like lonely. Apparently he was moved to England for private school for a while. He had no friends. So he'd walk around the woods as kids that age will, and just became very much in touch with nature. Moved back to Australia to help his mother. He got a job doing some photography for Ogilvy and Mather, which is a very big deal ad agency. And he works in things like photograms. This is a baby in shallow water in a photogram. Rabbits, the entrails of rabbits. He also worked in Cibachrome, by the way. These are Cibachrome prints. And they can be quite large, so there's a full life person in there. And it looks like snakes inside of a child's dress. Woman. Abelardo Morel. He fled Cuba in 1962. He does still lives in photography. He's received a number of awards. He also works with pinhole photography. That's cool. Andrea Serrano. Andrea Serrano is one of the more controversial photographers we're going to have to talk about today. He did the famous, well, his photography has gotten into some trouble and some demonstrations against him. He was accused of being a neo-Nazi, and 1,000 people basically demonstrated in front of a museum showing his work. He's noted for the famous, well, this is called Red Cross, but this is what he's really noted for. This is called Piss Christ, a small cross with Christ in a plastic container. Apparently, it is said with his own urine. And people broke into the museum and smashed this. And the museum director did not fix it, but said, you know, let's let people see what the barbarians did. Robert Mapplethorpe was a New York photographer. And his story is that in the 1970s, he and Cindy Smith decided that for 1 year, they would dress up and go to every art event in New York City and walk up and talk to as many people as they could. And in 1 year, they made their names inseparable from the art world of New York City. This stuff is considered extremely controversial. He has there's a gay theme to his images, lots of self-portraits, portraits of celebrities. He was awarded a National Endowment of the Arts. And this created a huge scandal, and people in Washington wanted to shut down the National Endowment of the Arts for supporting his artwork. That's Lisa Lyon, a model he used very often. But as you can see, his stuff can be extremely beautiful too. John Copeland's photographed basically self-portraits of his own aging body. Everything but his face, because his face doesn't matter. But he photographed his aging body to show what it means to get older and older. And at first he did it with a timer, and then later he got an assistant to help him photograph his body, aging skin. Nan Goldin is like my age, almost literally. And her work addresses the needs of the LGBT community and the HIV crisis, the opioid epidemic, and something called the post-Stonewall gay culture. Stonewall was a gay bar in New York City, and in 1969, for a number of years, the police would just go in there and just kind of like come in with clubs and hit gays and chase them out. And then in 1969, the police came in to just rouse them, and the gay guys said, "Hey, we're men, we have arms," and they beat the living daylights out of the cops. And it became this watershed moment in the gay world. Sally Mann is a little older than me. She's out of Virginia, and she works in very large format. She photographs her own children, and she has 2 daughters and a son. And she found that her children have an incredible maturity in their look. This is with a candy cigarette. And that's her older daughter in the center and her younger daughter on the right. That's her youngest daughter at the end of the dock. They live in Virginia on a river. Her stuff was, she did a book called Immediate Family with nudes of her own children. It was really controversial. And newspaper articles were art or pornography. And then at one point, the police found dead bodies on her farm, and she went out there. There had been a police shooting of a criminal suspect on the grounds of her farm in Virginia, and it made her reconsider questions of death. She found a place in Virginia where they do forensic studies of decaying bodies. So they'll have a body and they'll sort of leave it out there in the woods, and they know what it looks like at the point of death, and they watch decay so they can reverse engineer the process of death. And these are some of the bodies that this is her youngest daughter who got an insect bite in her eye. And she photographed, it looks like she got a black eye, but it's just an insect bite and caused her eye to swell up. So she photographed her daughter. And that's when it dawned on her that the thing to photograph is her own children, that they're the closest thing to her. And this is one of the bodies from that forensic study. That's her son. Her son actually took his own life just a few years ago. He was in his 30s and he had schizophrenia. These are the Guerrilla Girls. The Guerrilla Girls are an anonymous group out of New York City. And in 1985, they would do what we call guerrilla art. And they're Free the Women Artists of Europe. Museums keep them locked in the basement in storage out of sight. Museums show more art by women now. How many works by women artists were there in Warhol and the Tremaine auctions at Sotheby's? 0. Their identity is still a secret. They formed their group in 1985. And they've been advancing the rights of women and the need for women to be shown in art, for the artwork of women to be shown equally with men. That's an interesting point. Terry and Dennett Joe Spence collaborated on numerous photo projects over 2 decades. Their work is driven by social and political activism, which they've described as satirical postmodernity. That shouldn't be in there twice. Annette Messenger. She's French and she won the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale installations, which involved photography. In Venice, there's a thing called the Biennale. I attended it once, and all of Venice is full of art. And it's a huge contest, and she got the prestigious Golden Lion Award. She knits these, she takes photographs of these little knitted coverings for dead birds. Strange. This is almost installation art, but I showed it anyway. So this is based on photography inside of that. And there's photography of people's faces inside of this set. Clarissa Tsai formerly worked at NASA. She left NASA to be she's mostly a storyteller, and she combines photography with text for the exploration of history and social justice. Carrie Mae Weems is an American photographer known for her kitchen table series. And so this is a mother and daughter at the kitchen. There's actually a series of photographs about this. And here the woman's studying and the child's just left off to the side. She wants to basically be with her mother, do what her mother's doing. It is about family relationships. Laura Simpson. Paints on her photographs. I don't know what she's standing in. David Wojnarowicz. David Wojnarowicz is a year younger than me, born in the same town that I was born in. He's an American painter, writer, filmmaker, performance artist, political activist with his own struggle with AIDS, which took his own life, which killed him. But it is conceptual art. Now, Richard Misrach is a photographer, aren't they all? And he photographs in the Southwest. And his stuff is based on the impact of neglect of the earth. As you can see, this looks like Salton Sea. He has photographed the destruction. This is a backpack left behind by a immigrant at the border. He photographed, cactus in the desert. Also probably Salton Sea. He has photographed, oh, and then there's Trump's wall, his big, beautiful wall. He's also photographed nuclear sites where explosions have taken place. That's the Golden Gate. This is Joel Meyerowitz. Joel Meyerowitz, his breakthrough was in the 1960s. He decided that color is, in the early 1960s, color photography, black and white photography, that was art. Color photography was not, and he changed that. So yes, he did photograph in black and white. He was a street photographer in New York. But then he went to color and said, but the color is art too. This is from his book, Cape Light, about Cape May. And he was one of the few photographers permitted to take a large format camera into the wreckage of the Trade Center after 9/11, which we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of. Judy Dater is an American photographer who uses photography to challenge national concepts of female body, and she's a feminist. That's a self-portrait. She photographs celebrities. That's Ansel Adams. This is the photograph that made her famous. That's Imogene Cunningham on the left and a famous model named Twinkie on the right. And this was in Life magazine in 1976. Another dated photograph. Chuck Close. Chuck Close uses very large format to photograph portraits that hang in numerous museums. In 1988, that's a lot of self-portraits at first. Celebrities. That is Cindy Sherman, the Dalai Lama, Obama, Scarlett Johansson, Julia Roberts, Dustin Hoffman, William Dafoe. And this is another self-portrait of Chuck Close. Chuck Close suffered a significant spinal injury in 1988, which caused him to be paralyzed, but he continues to paint. But he had to stop photography. And that's another one of those pictures. Hillary, Bill, Clarence John Laughlin is an American photographer, surrealist. He has been compared to Truman Capote, William de Kooning, Ted Geisel, and Mark Twain, in the fact that he was able to reinvent his craft. I know that sounds crazy, but Truman Capote reinvented journalism in his book, In Cold Blood. William de Kooning reinvented photography. Geisel, children's book. Geisel is also known as Dr. Seuss. And Mark Twain reinvented writing and is considered the seminal writer of America. So Clarence John Laughlin, he had a rocky childhood, which influenced his work, as well as his southernness, his southern heritage, shaped his thinking of photography. Frederick Sommer is from Italy. He was raised in Brazil. He started to work with photography 1 year after he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. In 1938, he got an 8x10 camera. He photographed nudes, chicken parts, horizonless landscapes. Wow. Val Telberg was a Russian-born painter, later turned to surrealism and used photography in 1945 by sandwiching double negatives, exposures, and burning his negatives. So he created surrealism by damaging his artwork and using double negatives. Minor White, considered among America's greatest photographers and master printer. He was a closeted gay for fear of, he was afraid of losing his teaching job, so it was known that he was gay. He photographed a lot of his male students that he had become lovers with. an absolutely master printer. Harry Callahan. We know very little about him except he photographs his wife and his daughter, and that's his wife, Ellen. He basically, but every single day would go out and photograph all morning, come home and develop his film and make prints all afternoon. But he would also teach. Aaron Siskin was an abstract expressionist, making images of flat things look as flat as he could. They were abstracted from the original source. Win Bullock moved to France because to sing. He got a job in New York as a singer. He was inspired by the Impressionists of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Man Ray. So he took up photography and moved to Los Angeles to attend USC Law School to be near his mother. His mother had been a lawyer in California. He dropped out and went to Art Center College of Design, later moved to Monterey, where he met Edward Weston, became a straight photographer. Now, you see written on here is Family of Men. In 1955, there was a collection called The Family of Men. It was an important show of photographs. And he had 2 entries in it. This was one of the second most popular entry in The Family of Men. And that was the first. Child in the Forest. This made him nationally famous. William Klein was an American-born French photographer. He started painting and was ranked 25th of 100 top photographers in the United States. He worked for Vogue and documented many cities. Mario Giamelli, Italian family of modest means. His father died early. In 1953, he took up photography and joined a movement which was away from the pictorialists. Sorry about that. These are off the internet and they're not very good. So the pictorialists we've already discussed, and they were considered the accepted movement of fascist Italy, but because of his resentment of the fascism, he moved away from pictorialism into his own field. Henry Holmes Smith first studied at the Bauhaus, and then he taught at Bauhaus. Bauhaus was in Germany, and they were leaders of design, but as I've already mentioned, they fell out of grace with Hitler because they were considered just, Hitler's thinking was really small design-wise. So they bailed out of Germany and set up a Bauhaus in Chicago, where he ended up teaching. He pursued experimental photography as well as high-speed photography and double images. Richard Hamilton. He would do collages, and part of his thing was what makes modern homes so appealing. Elliot Porter is one of the guys who took color and carried it as far as it could be carried, and made color into fine art. Okay, so stop share. Go back to me for a second. Now, that was the last lecture, but I got to tell you, you still have a paper to write. I've only gotten a couple of them at this point, about the photographer of your choice. If you want to replay that and make note of the photographers whose work captured your imagination, that was a list. That was a good list of photographers you can write about to your heart's content, and turn that paper in. Submit your papers through Canvas while the getting's good. If you're blocked, email it to me at my Mount SAC email address as a Word doc or a PDF, and I can open it. I'm glad, I hope you enjoyed this class. This is the last time I'm going to talk to you. Next week, I'm going to assemble the final exam. Last week was Women in Photography, and there was no notes. And except for photojournalism, with this photography after 1950, again, there's no notes, which means that I will not be putting those names in the final exam. I wanted you to basically soak it in and enjoy it. Enjoy your summer. This is the last time I'll talk to you. Take care. End meeting.